Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's 1 minute past, which is our semi-official start time. It's lovely to see so many people here, and I'm delighted that today's talk is going to be by Minhyong Kim, who is someone who I know from his work on arithmetic geometry stuff, actually, originally. He is a professor at both Edinburgh University and the Korean Institute for Advanced Studies, but he's also more recently become the director of the ICMS, the International Centre for Mathematical Studies in Edinburgh, where he is leading a program called Mathematics for Humanities, for Humanity, which is something that is very in line with a lot of the things we care about here at Topos. So I'm very excited to hear his talk today, which is titled "Who Owns Mathematics? A Question of Identity." So please, Minhyong, whenever you're ready to start, feel free.
Okay, thank you very much for this kind invitation. My impression from past sessions that I've peeked into was that this is quite a friendly, informal session, so it's probably a good place to give the kind of talk that I've prepared, except now I can't find my slides. Okay, there it is. Right. In fact, to give you a little bit of the background of what occasioned me to speak about the kind of things I will speak about, it is exactly this program, Mathematics for Humanity, that the ICMS is sponsoring right now. So there was the first call for proposals, which closed in June, and then there will be another one, another deadline in December. So hopefully this will go on for a while. And here we're trying to support various activities by mathematical scientists in a very broad sense, right, that have the potential to directly impact human welfare. That's the idea. So I hope you're curious about this, and we will look at our webpage and look into the opportunities that we offer here. We're very broad-minded in the kind of proposals that we will consider. I'm very proud of our scientific committee, consisting of very distinguished mathematicians from all around the world. And as in the previous round, when we were looking at proposals, I was really moved in some sense that all these people were willing to really devote time and energy to looking at the proposals and try to do a good job. So we had one of these sessions like we're doing right now, a meeting where it was something like 11 o'clock in Korea, sometime in the afternoon in Europe, and 6 in the morning in California, and people still got together to iron out all the differences of opinion on what should be supported. So it's a very dedicated committee who will be looking at proposals, so I hope you'll propose things. So in the first round, just to give you a flavor, these are the kind of things that we approved. There are some more as well. I made these slides a while ago, but so this is a smattering of subjects that you'll see, which shows quite a variety. Now, within the kind of things that we support, you will see that there's a certain amount of mathematical history. So, for example, you'll see here current research on the history of mathematics in the ancient world, new questions and new approaches. So I've sometimes received the question, this is intriguing, I think, for many people, but I also have received the question, what does this have to do with mathematics for human welfare? Then that may not be so obvious. So in the process of trying to answer that question, I've prepared the kind of talk I'm giving today, okay, which I hope will explain why that theme is part of the program that we offer. So I'm going to try to answer this question in the title today, who owns mathematics? And in the course of doing that, I will say various things about identity, which is a complicated notion, of course. I will be saying a number of things about history, right? On which, of course, I'm not an expert. So I'll start with two reasons why I'm allowing myself to do this. One is kind of a general one. So this is there's an old paper of George Mackey where he's trying to explain, I think, the quantization of the electromagnetic field, and he apologizes as a mathematician for explaining physics. Then he says, well, but this is okay. Why? Because when you translate a book, the convention is for the translator to be a native speaker of the target language. So for mathematicians, it's probably best if another mathematician explains the physics. Right? And I'm taking a similar approach here. So there's some history involved here. And since I will be speaking, I think, mostly to people who are doing some version of mathematical sciences, I'm taking George Mackey's excuse myself. So what I did, in order not to mislead people, I invited some of my serious historian friends to come to this talk. I don't know if they can make it, but maybe they can. If not, if there's anybody else who's more knowledgeable about some of the things I say, feel free to interrupt, right, and correct whatever I need to say. Now, the second reason is that my whole point is that even as an amateur, it's going to help us in our mathematics, especially our teaching and questions of accessibility of mathematics to the wider world, to have an interest in history and have a better understanding of it than at least I have, and maybe other people will be also benefit from studying such things. So an amateur's perspective is what I'm trying to encourage anyways. So that's the second excuse. So with all those preliminary, let me move on, right, towards an answer to this question of who owns mathematics. I'll start with this quote that I've changed it slightly. So it says, science is a timeless, borderless adventure. Of course, I could say the same thing about mathematics. Okay? So Kamran Vafa, a distinguished mathematical physicist, says that, and then he says, if we take a snapshot of science today, we'll see various centers of excellence and some places that may be relatively quiet. But we should view this as not the property of science, but as transient phenomena. Sometimes science is strong in one place, sometimes in the other. It's not the territory of a particular area. It's not the territory of a particular people. It's an adventure for the entire humankind. I think almost nobody would disagree with this these days. Certainly nobody in this audience, I think, would disagree with this. However, the degree of conviction with which we say such things can vary considerably depending on what we know about history. So one can make a proclamation of this sort in a kind of paternalistic way, or this could be what you really believe based upon accurate knowledge of the way the mathematical tradition has been constructed. So this is largely what my talk is about. It's about how to believe things like this with conviction in a knowledgeable way. Just to give an illustration of the kind of things that Vafa is speaking about in this quote, so I thought I'd just start with a simple example, which many of you probably understand better than I do, but I'll describe it anyways. It's sometimes called the Babylonian algorithm. This is this algorithm for computing square roots. It's hard to know, at least I haven't been able to figure out with superficial search, right, where this originated. And that's true, of course, of many great mathematical discovery. The precise origin is very hard to discover, no matter what the history books say. History books are often filled with mythology, and then you try to really track down the source of what it's about. It's hard to find it. Anyways, what is this algorithm? Well, so it's something that's illustrated by this little tablet here that's in the Yale Babylonian collection, dated to sometime between 1800 and 1600 BCE. And many of you will know that this tablet in those cuneiform symbols contains a remarkably accurate approximation to the square root of 2. Of course, I've decimalized it, which is a little bit misleading, but that's okay. I think it still illustrates how accurate the approximation there actually was. And one might wonder how one computed such things, so such high degree of accuracy. It's probable, at least possible, that they used this algorithm that's called the Babylonian algorithm. So how does that go? So it's very simple. If you want to calculate a square root of a number that I'm calling D, you start with any guess, A, and I'm calling A1. And then there's an iterative process for going to A2, A3, A4, and so on, right? So what is that iteration? That's also very, very simple. That is what it looks like, right? You start with A1, then add to it d divided by a1, where d is the number whose square you want, right? And then divide by 2. In other words, you average between your first guess and d over that first guess. And then you keep going. That's the algorithm. Now, the rationale for this algorithm, which again, it was very, very elementary, but I'll explain it briefly, is very simple. Well, sorry, I prepared an example first. For example, if you wanted square root of 2, you just start out with a random guess, 1. You could guess something else, actually, but 1, it turns out. We know it's 1 point something. 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4. So we may as well start with 1. Then the A2 will be the average between 1 and 2 divided by 1, right? So you get 1.5. And A3 will be the average between 3 halves and 2 over 3 halves, which is 4 thirds, right? If you calculate that, you get 1.416. You see that you're getting the value that we know fairly quickly. If you compute A4, in fact, you get to 1.4142. It's very accurate already at this stage, right? I'm not an expert on these kind of approximation algorithms at all, but I've been told that this is one of these ancient algorithms that hasn't been improved upon. If somebody knows to the contrary, please correct me. But as far as I've been able to, this is correct. This is still the best way, most efficient way of calculating square roots. The reason this works, I will also explain that briefly because I think there's something to be learned from that as well. The reason this works is illustrated by this picture, right? So if you had some d and you have a square root of d. So let's say you put here along the line some true value, right? And then if your guess a1 was here, then d over a1 will be somewhere here, and the average will be closer to square root of d. That's the basic idea. So to say that slightly more precisely, if a1 is less than square root of d, then d over a1 is necessarily bigger than square root of d because they multiply to d, right? So when you average it, it gets closer. So that's the idea. I think it's worth thinking about this proof briefly because historians have written about this question of how they came up with this algorithm, how ancient people may have come up with this. And I don't think of course, they don't know exactly. But some of the discussion that I've seen in history papers, at least 1 or 2 that I've seen, seem to be overcomplicating matters. That's one thing I think, so this is just an aside, but that we can, I think that we can contribute to history of mathematicians, because it's true that mathematicians can be very naive about history and not know what it means to think like somebody thinking in 2000 BC. That's true too. On the other hand, we do have insights about what is mathematically natural. And sometimes in my interaction with historians, I feel like historians miss this point that what's regarded as mathematically natural, I think they may be a little bit too cautious about thinking about the possibilities for the past than a mathematicians might be. So we don't want to be dogmatic from our perspective, but the insight might be contributed. So anyways, this seems like a very simple enough thing that somebody might have come up with, but it's clearly a very conceptually powerful idea. The second point I want to make about this algorithm is that nowadays you might want to prove that this actually converges to square root of d, right? But there's a sense, I hope anybody who does mathematics in practice can agree that there's a sense in which the proof is a bit secondary. The ingenuity of the argument of the algorithm itself, the process itself, I think is more important than proving that it converges to square root of d. So this can happen often, even within mathematical problem, that the idea for carrying out a process can be more important than proving that it does what you want it to do. Maybe this is an example of that. But anyways, so there we go. So that's the Babylonian algorithm. I'm going on and on about it. So I just thought I'd give you a brief picture, snapshot of the ways in which this was refined and generalized over the millennia. This is just a very haphazard collection. I'm not claiming any accuracy or completeness with this list. Nonetheless, this is I think all of these people contributed in some way to the developments that arose out of the Babylonian algorithm. Going up to say Newton and Raphson, who wanted to find the root of a general polynomial compared to just the square root, right? But the Babylonian algorithm is a special case now from present day perspective of the Newton method, right? And then Gauss's contribution on the fundamental theorem of algebra and so on. I would tend to view this as all arising from this ancient problem of computing square roots, which seems to culminate, in my view, in this paper of the 20th century by the three authors, Hubbard, Schleicher, and Sutherland. What did they do? This paper, I think, deserves to be very well known. I think I'm sure some of you know about it. Maybe not everybody. It's this paper called "How to Find All Roots of Complex Polynomials" by Newton's method. So this appeared in 2001. What they show you really is algorithmically inside the complex plane, how to set things up in such a way that you have a sequence of points that converges to a root, and you're able to know for sure that you'll be able to approximate all roots. I'm not saying this very well, so you can look at the picture to get a precise statement. But what they do is they divide the complex plane up into regions, such that if you start within any given region, you converge to a root, right? And you get all roots this way. So this was only completed. So if any of you learned Newton's method, right, during calculus and wondered when it works and when it doesn't, the answer is, but it wasn't completely understood until the 21st century. That's also quite interesting. Yeah. And so why am I saying all this? Well, there are a number of reasons to reflect on this algorithm, but the main point related to the Vafa quote, Qumran Vafa quote, is that this is a research that went on for about 4,000 years almost, from the beginning to this paper. And again, if you go back to the previous slide, it really was a collective effort from many different parts of the world. And my impression is that a lot of mathematics is like this. So that's kind of just an example. But as I said, we want to move towards the answer to the question I posed. Who owns mathematics? And I think that is a sensible question. Part of what I'm trying to do is convince you that it is. So I will digress now to the second part of my title. It's not a digression, of course, but from the point of view of the answer that comes about eventually, it may look like a digression, and talk about identities. So here's a character I like to think of often when considering this question of identity. Abu Rayhan Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Biruni. He somehow connects up to the previous discussion because it's highly plausible that he used this accurate method for calculating square roots when he calculated the radius of the Earth in the 11th century to within 1% of accuracy. This was astounding accuracy for the time. Of course, there's a lot of discussion and debate on this accuracy as well. Are you correctly translating his units to what we know now, etc., etc.? So one can ask this question about any historical figure and any calculation that was done in the past. Such debate exists with this calculation as well. Nonetheless, so this is one view of the situation. He calculated the radius of the Earth. So he had to know how to calculate trigonometric functions to a high degree of accuracy. That's one thing, and he had to calculate square root. I'm not going to dwell on that method at the moment, but instead focus on the identity of this figure. Now you will see from the picture, right, that this is a postage stamp, right? And you can probably guess where this postage stamp was produced. Actually, when I speak to students, I ask them to actually raise their hands and give answers. So maybe that's a little bit insulting to this audience here. So it's here, right? It was produced in the Soviet Union. The CCCP is our USSR, Soyuz Rus is the first word, then Cyrillic, and then the words corresponding to Soviet Socialist Republic. But here's a more serious question. This I will ask the audience. Why was this produced in the Soviet Union? 1973 is a hint. I guess answers can be put into the chat box if you'd like. Would you like to have a go? Or people are allowed to unmute and speak as well, right, Tim?
There was the October War in the Middle East, and the Soviet Union was, or at least the US were scared that they would intervene, etc. And maybe they wanted to get closer to the Arab world. I don't know. Guessing with Nasser.
That's an interesting guess. It's wrong, but it's an interesting guess. Any other guesses? Oh, so there's something in the chat box. There's something, there's an answer that says birthday. I'm not sure I understand that answer.
It looks like this was his 1000th birthday. I think that's what the chat was referring to.
Possibly, but why would the Soviet Union be producing this stamp? Is what I'm asking. No answers? Once I asked this question to primary school students and there was an answer. Gosh, I'm a bit disappointed. But anyway, the point is, okay, so there's maybe one other attempt. Valeria says the Soviets were good at producing mathematics for all. Okay, there's a very nice answer as well, which shows, which illustrates the purity of your heart. I like it, but that's not correct either. So the answer
maybe he
is
lived in a place that became part of the Soviet Union.
Indeed, yeah, exactly. So who was that? Sorry. Oh, it's okay anyway. So
I have no idea, but there's a whole bunch of places in the Caucasus that fit both his name and Soviet.
That was Andreas. Yeah, thank you. That's correct. So the point is
Uzbekistan.
Exactly. So this guy was born in Khorazm, which is a very important area in the history of mathematics. Right? So another famous person born there was Al-Khwarizmi. Right? And there were also people like Avicenna. They were all born in roughly the same region, which is in present-day Uzbekistan, which at that time belonged to the Soviet Union. So that's the answer. And official Soviet position was they were as much interested in multiculturalism and promoting diversity within the Union as we might be. So this is a stamp commemorating Al-Biruni, who from their point of view was Soviet. So
Minhyong, just to complete my answer, the thing is in South America, there were lots of books, like apostol books, lots of books, calculus produced by the Soviet Union that were much, much, much cheaper than the books produced locally. So that's why I'm talking about.
No, I'm sorry. I hope it didn't sound like I was belittling your answer. I really liked the answer.
No.
Sorry about that. I wasn't intending to have something like that as well. But no, that's true. I mean, Soviet reach around many, or the Soviet sphere, the cultural reach around the world is often unappreciated within Europe and North America. But that's also true. Now, why am I bringing up this character? Well, it's because I wanted to discuss his identity a little bit, which is related to my line of questioning, right? So that is, I want to ask ourselves now, was in fact Al-Biruni Soviet? Is it reasonable to say that this was a Soviet person? Now, many people will object, of course, right? What does this even mean? But I think you'll see, I'm sure many of you will guess already, but by the end of this lecture, I think you will agree that there are plenty of other assumptions about ancient identity which are just as strange, at least as strange as the idea that Al-Biruni was Soviet. At least as anachronistic. Maybe Al-Biruni was Uzbek. Maybe that's slightly better. Or maybe slightly worse. It depends. You know. Depends on what you mean by Uzbek. Maybe most of us just know less about Uzbekistan, so this doesn't look as strange as the assertion that Al-Biruni was Soviet. Another possibility that's brought up often is maybe he was Iranian. A variant on that assertion is that maybe he was Persian. The relation between being Iranian and Persian is also sometimes a sensitive issue on which many questions of identity hinge. But in any case, some people vociferously argue that he was in fact Persian, because somehow the Central Asian civilization at that time, which was extremely active, produced a lot of scholarship, art, and literature, was in fact an extension of Persian civilization. That's a common claim that's being made. Even now by various people who study the region. Was he Arabic? In fact, many people who vociferously argue that he was Persian argue that he was not Arabic. So that's one of the reasons that they give for being so strong about this Persian identity. So I will say more about this last possibility later on as the slides progress. But anyways, I hope you find these questions at least amusing. Right. So that's how this is one personality with which I wanted to start up my discussion about identity. So now I will move on to some misconceptions about identity. Well, I guess I've already alluded to some misconceptions in this discussion about Al-Biruni, right? But now maybe I will levy some more direct criticism, right? Some famous misconceptions by famous personalities. So here is a quote with which I'll illustrate the kind of thing I'm speaking about. This is from Alfred North Whitehead's Introduction to Mathematics, published in 1911. So he says, the death of Archimedes by the hands of a Roman soldier is symbolical of a world change of the first magnitude. The theoretical Greeks, with their love of abstract science, were superseded in the leadership of the European world by the practical Romans. When I read this, to be honest, I get a little bit angry. How can people write nonsense like this? And this was a respected intellectual, presumably regarded as a highly educated person, right? But there's almost no part of this quote that's correct. Right? Besides the fact that he's stating as though it were history, something that's basically mythology. And when you question people about like this, they'll point to some ancient source, say Plutarch, for example, right? But there are very, very few sources, right? So can we say trust one author whom some other authors then cite, and so on and so on. So when you go to the ancient world, when you look for concrete grounds for believing a story, like the story about Archimedes, there's very, very little to back it up. Nonetheless, for people of those times, Whitehead and Victorian people before that, it was quite common to just take this kind of mythology as history and part of their worldview in a standard way. I'm going to challenge one other aspect of this. Well, this mythology story is a little bit too vast and complicated for me to discuss right now, but let me talk about some other aspect of this, which is maybe a more focused and better known as well. So Whitehead here is appealing to this common stereotype that there were no Roman mathematicians. People often think there were no Roman mathematicians, and they try to give all kinds of arguments or reasons of the sort that Whitehead is implicitly alluding to here, right? The Romans were somehow practical; they weren't theoretical people like Greeks, and so they couldn't do mathematics. They were engineers, etc., engineers and accountants. Now, I think even before thinking about the fact of the matter with any degree of accuracy, a characterization of this sort, by now I think anybody can see this couldn't possibly be true, right? These are complex societies with all kinds of people. How could one capture in a simple-minded characterization the nature of entire civilizations of this sort, right? So attempts to come up with reasons of that sort can't possibly be true, even with our intuitive understanding of the world. But in fact, this question, why were there Roman mathematicians, interestingly, has a very precise answer. So that's my second question to the audience. Can you guess what that answer is? One doesn't have to fudge about with various theories and things that are hard to verify and so on. There's an obvious answer to this question.
Is it because they've just been like defined out of existence?
Exactly, yeah. So since we're mathematicians, we know, right, or many of us are mathematicians, that when I say something for sure, right, something is known for sure, then often it's a question of definition or something that follows from definitions, right? So in fact, if you look at some Roman mathematicians of the Roman Empire, so these were clearly very distinguished people, right, who are very influential in subsequent generations, even now. But they were simply defined out of existence. These people are said to be not Roman. And that's what's behind the stereotypes that Whitehead is working with when he makes a proclamation of this. So I'll expand on this a little bit further later, but maybe there's a question. Actually, Valeria, your question, your point is actually also very interesting. Did they or did they not call themselves mathematicians? That's very hard to say. But by the way, for people who like to construct these simple-minded theories, like Whitehead is articulating over here, they often do exactly things like that, play with the definition of a mathematician. I mean, Whitehead is completely clueless, but even more serious historians, they like to either expand or restrict the definition of mathematicians so that a theory will turn out to be true. That's a very common ploy as well. Anyway, I'll say more about this question within a few slides. So here's another thing I'd like to challenge, which is in some sense more serious even. Why were Greeks and Romans leaders of the European world? Here, we're not talking about current day people who live in the city of Rome or people who are current day Greeks, right? We're talking about ancient Greeks. These three people, for example, lived in Alexandria, or as far as we know. And there are many people who somehow are called Greeks or Romans spread around the world, or at least around the Mediterranean world, let's say, right? So in what sense were they Europeans? What's meant by European here, right? So what Whitehead, if you look at the rest of his book, he clearly understands Europe as he knew it in his time. Which again is a little bit different from the Europe that we know. But what does it mean for them to be leaders of the European world? Is this, in fact, better than the idea that Al-Biruni was Soviet? If you have an argument why it's better, I'd like to hear it, but there's also a chat. Okay, Valeria, you point out Ptolemy was an astronomer. That's also true, but he also did, there's lots of mathematics in his work as well. So it's perfectly reasonable to classify him as a mathematician too. But anyway, let's go. We'll return to that question later as we progress. Your points are all very valid. But for the moment, I do also want to point out that this idea that ancient Greeks and Romans are European or leaders of the European world, this is at least as questionable as the idea, I think more questionable than the idea that Al-Biruni was Soviet. So let's examine this just a little bit. The idea of what it means to be European certainly has changed over time. It probably has crystallized in the 20th century in much stronger form than before. That's a position one could defend. But for example, let's look at this quotation. I won't read the whole thing to you. This is from Aristotle's Politics from the 4th century BC. So Aristotle, of course, and even in those days, there was a notion of Europe, there was a notion of Asia, there was a notion of Libya, and so on, right? And Aristotle indulges in his own stereotypes. And what is he trying to say? He says, well, Europeans, they're very spirited, but they're not very smart. Asians, on the other hand, are quite smart, but they have no spirit, so they're always subject to slavery. And the Greeks, on the other hand, are somewhere in the middle, so they're much better than those. They're just perfect. So that's what Aristotle is trying to say here, right? So whatever he meant by European, he didn't regard himself as European. That's completely clear. And so there's a lot of other literature on this matter, but in any case, so here's Aristotle. What about the Romans? Well, here's the Roman Empire in the early 2nd century, for example. It was during a very large expanse, right? Expansionary period. Now, maybe from our point of view, we would like to view them as really being over here and if somehow expanded out to the east. I don't know if that makes any sense whatsoever. Okay. So here's a picture, for example, of Rome in the 7th century, just to point out the nature of these misconceptions more clearly. Right? In order to fit into this idea that Romans were actually European, there's a standard trick for dealing with this map as well. Some of you may know it. One standard trick, which again makes no sense whatsoever, is to say that this wasn't really Roman at that time. There's this strange idea that Eastern Roman Empire was not really Roman. If you ask yourself, where did this idea come from? That's an interesting question. I'll let you investigate this for yourself, especially if you're interested in history. Try looking up, why did people start regarding 476 AD as the fall of the Roman Empire? And of course, you will know that Eastern Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years, right? So why do we think that the genuine Rome ended then? Which was a common conception for a long time. I suspect Whitehead believed things like that. And you'll find interesting things related to this question. Part of the reason was that, of course, the Eastern Roman Empire, during various periods, subsequent periods, let's say starting in the medieval times and so on, was regarded as Greeks during a period before Greeks were popular in Europe. Anyways, I hope at least I'm raising reasonable questions as to whether the ancient Greeks or Romans should be regarded as European. And again, I invite you to compare it with the question of whether Al-Biruni was Soviet or Uzbek. These kind of misconceptions, this is where we're moving into maybe the ethics portion, which I think this colloquium is also concerned with. Why are these relevant questions? What are the effects of misconceptions of this? Well, I think you can easily imagine for yourself a lot, right? Here's a kind of example. This is from Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. So this is a short passage. There's a lot of interesting material surrounding it as well. But essentially, what he's trying to say here is that blacks can't do mathematics. And he makes this point by claiming that there's no way of finding one who could comprehend the investigations of Euclid. So this is a very serious claim, and I hope it illustrates the relevance to our times of figuring out, of identifying ancient people in one way or another, because obviously no one knows anything about Euclid's ethnicity. We don't know whether Euclid was a man or a woman or a group, or if they existed. Right? Well, many people seem to agree that if they did exist, they lived most of their life in Africa. Yeah. So by what stretch of the imagination does Thomas Jefferson regard himself as closer to Euclid than a random black person? It's not at all clear. So there's a lot of possible explanations or defenses that some people might offer to Jefferson's claim. I haven't heard one yet that really holds up to scrutiny. And a lot of them rely on arbitrary classifications of race as well. So for example, some people will say, well, this was North Africa, and North Africans aren't black. So we can argue about that some more, but I invite anybody who is inclined to make that argument just to look at the different pro and con positions with regard to that claim. So, maybe one way of formulating my own skepticism about all claims of that sort is, again, as a mathematician, many of you will have heard the assertion that genetic variation within Africa is larger than the differences between Africa and without. Now, another way of posing my skepticism is asking, if you believe that Euclid was not black, right? You have to answer, where does white end and black begin? And as a mathematician, you're probably aware that there's no answer to that question. So in other words, as far as any of the research that I've seen is concerned, whether you use the classification by genetic information or classification by phenotypic information, the humanity as a whole just does not cluster in any meaningful way if you put it into a data space. So when they say Euclid was not black, what do we mean by this exactly? Or in any case, why does Thomas Jefferson think that he's closer to Euclid than somebody else? That is the question that needs to be asked in response to this quote. Now, of course, this kind of ignorance of identity is typical of many mathematicians of the ancient world. Thales lived in present-day Turkey. Pythagoras was born in Samos, but lived and studied all around the Mediterranean. Some of the ancient authors say that his father was from present-day Lebanon. Eratosthenes was born and lived in present-day Libya. And as I said, these three people, Heron, Ptolemy, Diophantus, were all born and lived in present-day Egypt. Now, these people, all of the aforementioned names are often said to be Greek. And many of you will have been inclined to point this out as well. So why would they have been identified as Greek? Perhaps there are some suggestions for answers there. Why were they Greek? Why do we say they were Greek?
Well, they wrote in the Greek language, or at least that's, the books we have.
Ah, very good. That's true. Yeah, that's true. Any other suggestions? By the way, in the case of some of these people, like Thales, we have no idea about that as well, because he's quoted by other people, right? Some other suggestions in the chat box. The Greeks recognized their greatness, maybe, or named them possibly. Tim, you said that they wrote their math in Greek. Okay, very good. So let's examine that question a little bit, right? So nowadays, this controversy is very well known among professional historians. Somehow, it has the ambiguity of all this hasn't spread out to the general intellectual community as much as it should have. But historians are well aware of the ambiguity regarding these identities, and they might take up a position and defend it or attack it and so on, right? Nonetheless, it is a complicated matter. So here's a very well-known, well-received recent book on Greeks. Roderick Beaton is a very respected historian at King's College London. It's a good book. I'm not trying to attack the book in general. Right? Nonetheless, he's clearly aware of this possible ambiguity and controversy. So what he says in the introduction is, the Greeks of the title and the pages that follow are to be understood as speakers of the Greek language. So it's close to the answer that some of you have given, right? Now, what's wrong with that? Well, there are lots of things, but let me just point out two things for the moment. One is that, well, sorry, let me back up a little bit. So that's the definition. You can say he can use any definition he wants, right? And try to develop arguments in a manner consistent with that definition. So of course, matters aren't as simple as when we define something, as we do even in mathematics, we don't make arbitrary definitions, right? We make definitions that we feel are reasonable. So there's no such thing as a neutral definition. So that's one thing to consider if we feel like he's allowed to use any definition he wants. Another criticism, right, is that a lot of these people, we have no idea what they spoke. All we have is a complicated transmission of a few works that were written. For example, from the so-called Hellenistic age, would have been written in Koine Greek. In the case of Thales, nothing whatsoever that survives of what he wrote. We see quotations here and there. We have no idea what they spoke. As to whether or not this definition is reasonable, right, or sensible, I just wanted to point out that this is why some people might claim that Al-Biruni was Arabic. His works are all written in Arabic. Newton's major works are written in Latin, so there's a Roman mathematician for you, by this logic. Will all be included in a book on the global history of the English written by a future historian. Now, this last point, I've made this point to my friends in ancient history, most of whom are quite sympathetic to the questions I'm raising. But interestingly, it seems not to have occurred to a lot of previous generations of historians. In spite of the fact that we're all communicating with each other in English, it really does not seem to have occurred to a lot of previous generations of historians that this is a separate issue from identity. So it's very interesting. So as I said, you don't have to take my word for it. All I'm trying to do here is raising some questions for you to investigate as well, if you're interested. So if you take this all together and go back and say, why are these people called Greek? Anyways, I don't have any satisfactory answer to that at the moment, other than political motivations and building of identity, which I'll say more about in a minute. Okay, maybe I didn't even have to include this, but you also have ridiculous things like this quotation, from Hardy's Mathematicians Apology, which is a silly book in many ways, but it contains nonsense like this as well. Anyways, since I spoke a lot about misconceptions, maybe I'll also say something about the complexities surrounding identity. This is sort of an aside. It's really not part of the main line of argument or discussion right now, but it is maybe worth saying a few words about how complex identities are, even now when we feel within regions that we feel like we understand, right? So like, for example, within Europe, this kind of Greco-Roman heritage is a popular thing to believe in, at least among intellectuals and educated people, right? But so here's a picture from the 17th century by Rembrandt. This was commissioned by the Amsterdam City Council, right, as a kind of symbol of national pride. Claudius Civilis is a character from Tacitus's history, right, who led the Batavian rebellion against the Romans. Right? This rebellious character who did not accept the Roman identity at all was regarded as a symbol of national pride at that time. Right? Such things are all over Europe, of course, because at some point, while I was traveling around various countries, I often asked this question: how come nobody says we attacked Rome? This is a question I've seriously asked in various countries, right? So, and having asked that and tried to look for answer, I find that the answer to that varies in various places. And the short answer is that they do say this, right? Like here. But so this idea that the barbarians attacked Rome, and thereby implying that we somehow identify with Romans, is also one idea among many, even within identities of people in Europe. So here's another example of that sort. This is the Hermann monument. Hermann, the German so-called, who was led the Germanic tribes against the Romans in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. So sometimes he used to be regarded as the founder of the German nation in certain kinds of mythology. until it became kind of somewhat associated with Nazism and unpopular. By the way, he was called Arminius in a lot of old documents, right? Similar to this person, Claudius Civilis, although they could hardly have been Roman, right? Even by the standards, but even by according to the accounts, mythological accounts that exist. And of course, many of you probably know about Vercingetorix, who was the Gaul leader of the Gauls who resisted the conquests of Caesar. Well, there are many things of this sort, even within regions that we understand, which indicate the complexity of identity, even when we feel like we understand it. Although I hope it's all reasonably obvious why I'm talking about these things, let me also point out another relevance of why do we need to be aware of these things, for example, as mathematicians, as educators. So there's an institution in the UK called the Quality Assurance Agency for Higher Education. It's an independent body entrusted with monitoring and advising on standards and quality in UK higher education. They work with government agencies and institutions globally to benefit UK higher education and its international reputation. I think it was 2 years ago they came up with, last year rather, a benchmark for mathematics, statistics, and operational research, which was very much discussed and debated because it contained a passage that the curriculum should present a multicultural and decolonized view of these subjects informed by the student voice. And a lot of mathematicians, well-meaning mathematicians, objected to this. The grounds for the objection were something that I would actually sympathize with. The basic response, the gist of the response to this recommendation of the QAA by many people who are my friends as well, right, was that mathematics is universal. We don't really need to think about multicultural views of the subject. It is a universal thing. And I agree with this, and I think many people would agree with this, except to really understand, say this with conviction, not as a paternalistic perspective. Right? We need to do a lot of work to understand history accurately and see where the framework of our conceptions come from. So here's so let me conclude then. This is a collection of remarks about history, identity, and its relevance. We're pointing out some obvious things, right? First of all, Whitehead lived in a milieu where some Europeans, anyways, they claimed the ancient Greco-Roman tradition by embracing it and studying it. The reasons for this is very complicated. People have written many books about the background for doing this, right? Having to do with the identity politics in Europe at the time, right? Germans wanted to create an identity against the French. Some people wanted to create a European identity against Arabic countries, etc., etc. There's a lot of identity politics from roughly the 17th century to the 19th century associated with this creation of a cultural framework for thinking about the past. And of course, this is very, very common. Everybody creates their tradition out of things that they admire or dislike from the past, okay? Including reaching to the distant past if they're trying to oppose something that came just before. Okay? So, for example, in the 16th century, when people were developing algebra, there were definitely people who didn't want to credit the Arab contribution, right? And then were very, very happy when they found Diophantus had written about algebra before that and said that this is the true algebra that we need to learn from. You'll find comments like this in the works of people like Bombelli or Vieta. It's a very common thing that people have done. And some of it is natural, some of it is probably somewhat pernicious. But the point is, so what lesson I think we should draw from this, right? And this is close to one of the answers to my earlier question that's given by one of the people, right? I think the positive lesson to draw from these ruminations is that right now, right, Mathematics really belongs to whomever studies and uses it. And that's the way it's been. If we think that certain mathematics is European or Chinese or Indian, right, the truth behind these assertions is very questionable because of these incredible mixtures that have occurred over millennia. Right? But similar to how Europeans claimed the ancient Greco-Roman tradition, it's possible for anybody to like the mathematics they see and study it and claim it for their own. But for us to be able to say this and talk about it with our students and to the global community, we do have to educate ourselves on an accurate history of the ancient world. And there's a lot of it now. It's not spread out, as I said, within the intellectual population as a whole, but almost no serious current day generation historians believe the simple-minded myth of the sort that appears in Whitehead. But we do need to educate ourselves about it. And in particular, we need to acquire and disseminate an accurate view of the history of mathematics. Now, the interesting thing is, and this I believe in very strongly, at this point for us now, we really have nothing to lose by doing this. Yeah? There was a period in the past when, for example, a classicist might have liked the idea that they are the inheritors of ancient Greece and Rome, and this might have been associated to a lot of interest and national identity and national interest, right? We as mathematicians, by taking a more expansive view to really accurately understand the human heritage of mathematics, we really have nothing to lose and a great deal to gain. I think this is something to keep in mind when carrying out these investigations. So at the ICMS, we've been, as I said, as part of this Mathematics for Humanity project, we've been having workshops related to, well, which investigates this question, look at the research on this question, also try to disseminate it among mathematicians. I've also organized such events at the Korea Institute for Advanced Study. So let me just close by recommending a few books to look at for people who are interested. So here's a very nice book from which I learned a lot, which was edited by my friend Karin Chandla, History of Mathematical Proof in Ancient Traditions. Then she has an introductory essay in that book, which starts out with this sentence, which I found to be really striking and which really somehow changed my perspective greatly. The standard history of mathematical proof in ancient traditions at the present day is disturbingly simple. I really like this sentence. Right? How could it possibly be true, what they say about proof? Right? That somehow the first appearance is in Euclid. There was no mathematics before that, etc. It's such a simple-minded story. It can't possibly be true. It's sort of like what I was saying about Whitehead. A story like that can't possibly be true, right? So what's really going on, and how did people come to believe things like that, right? It's very interesting to investigate this kind of history as well. This is a slightly different book of a different flavor, which I do recommend. This is by Joanna Hanning, The Classical Debt, which has to do with the construction of Greek identity in 19th century. It's rather specific because she's interested in its relevance to modern Greece in particular, right? But so it's slightly different from our mathematical concern, but still is quite interesting as an example of the way the past is constructed for modern purposes and how it impacts modern people. And a really remarkable book, which came out in the 1980s, some of you may have heard of it, which started out a lot of the current day investigation into trying to get a more accurate view of the ancient histories, this book, Black Athena. So this was written by Martin Bernal, who is dead now, but and it was much debated soon after it came out. So if you Google this, you'll find from the 1990s enormous amount of criticism and debate surrounding this book. Right? Also, it's partly because of the title, which apparently was decided by the publisher, that is about Black Athena. So Martin Bernal isn't trying to claim that certain people were Black or not. He comes much closer to what I said earlier, denying the meaning the meaningfulness of racial classification altogether. But nonetheless, this was a somewhat sensationalistic title, which led to some misunderstanding. But in any case, what it did was it generated a lot of debate and acrimony. But almost any classicist you speak to now seems to agree they really changed the subject in spite of all that. There were lots of mistakes in it as well about archaeology and history of languages and so on. Nonetheless, it really seems to have changed the landscape. So especially in the US, a lot of the departments of classics have really reorganized their curriculum and are trying to make them whatever they teach about ancient Greece and Rome part of a much broader picture of things that happened in the ancient world. And this book was really instrumental in bringing about these changes. And as I was saying earlier, other intellectuals simply have to catch up on what the latest developments in these studies, in particular mathematicians, when it comes to our own subject. So I'll make a rather strong statement in closing. A lot of what we know about history of mathematics, or at least what I knew about history of mathematics before going down this route, was quite frankly nonsense. People made up all kinds of myths in order to say something interesting. Right? Now, to some extent, some people believe this was harmless because they say, well, it might have been inspiring to people. Say something like, if you look at a book like E.T. Bell's Men of Mathematics or something, they're full of all kinds of unsubstantiated nonsense, which might be entertaining sometimes. And there are some books that do slightly better, but not that much better. So one really needs to do a lot of work to get an accurate understanding. Now, you might view it as harmless, and maybe I also viewed it as harmless at some point, even knowing that it wasn't very reliable, but I don't view it that way anymore. Part of it is like what you might think about fairy tales about princesses and prince. Right? Sometimes some people might view that as harmless. I don't think that's harmless anymore. I don't think too many people think about the story about the princess that eventually gets rescued by a prince as being simply entertainment and inspiration. There are various things that lead to a misleading picture of the world coming out of these mythology. It doesn't mean that we have to denounce people from the past and things like this. Nonetheless, I think as teachers especially, it will help us greatly to try to have a more accurate overall picture of how we arrived at where we are. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minhyong, for that wonderful talk. Yes, okay, there's lots of applause in the chat. Okay, yeah, before we move on to questions, I just want to say thank you again. That was a really enjoyable talk. And it looks like we already have a question from our own David Spivak. So David, would you like to fire away?
Yes, thanks for the talk. That was really interesting. You spent a lot of time deconstructing, or from my point of view, deconstructing identity or saying that it's problematic. In some sense, it seems people use it as a source of pride to distinguish themselves from others, and maybe even kind of like profiling to say, like, you should give me credit because I'm the kind of person who in the past has done, I have the same race or gender as the kind of people who have been successful. But I'm wondering if that seems accurate, and also, but more, is there any positive function of identity? I've struggled to understand what the purpose of it is or how it helps us. Is there anything left? Is there something to rescue that's important about identity?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Actually, no, that's a very, very good question. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're pointing to is the fact that a sense of identity can help people who are oppressed as well, for example, right? In various situations. Gosh.
Certainly to combat, if we can combat, false and negative narratives about identity, but what about not just combating, but as some kind of positive function? What can it serve?
There can be a sense of solidarity among people who need help, for example, coming from a sense of identity. It's a very good point. Yeah, I don't want to give a facile answer to this right now. So let me just say that's a very good question and something worth thinking about.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Valeria, you had a question?
Yeah, Valeria has her hand up.
Oh, hi. It was a great talk, really kind of very, very nice. Thanks so much. I think I wanted to ask about the fact that, there's another, you talked about races and nationalities, but there's another aspect that you didn't touch much on, which is this business of the metropolis versus the colonies and stuff like that, or places that are considered colonies. And I wonder if you could comment on this business of, it's a way of enforcing power, and hence if the colonies kind of start getting their own mathematics, or kind of start being recognized as mathematical societies, I think that would be a way of making things more universal in the right sense. And hence, the question is, how do we, if you want mathematics to be for all, how do we go about it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the notion of colony, of course, is very complicated, and people use it in a somewhat arbitrary way as well. But I guess one example to think about is the case of America, which was a colony, and which is a mathematical superpower now, right? And Americans no longer think about themselves as being British either, right? Even though in a sense it's quite a short while ago by historical standards that they would have been a British colony. And maybe that example is worth thinking about somewhat anyways in the question of how to bring about positive change in the identity of colonies, for example.
Right, yeah, yes, thank you. That's a good point.
Yeah. Andreas?
The story happens in such a long, in such a large scale, right? It's difficult to see it as it is. Sorry.
Andreas, I think you have a question.
Couldn't quite hear you, but I assume you were talking to me.
Yeah.
I don't have a question. I have, nor do I have an answer. But I want to pass along, in connection with David's question about positive versus negative aspects of pride in one's ancestors or alleged ancestors or whatever. Peter Fried once explained it in very brief terms. He said there are two effects of pride in one's, I think he was talking generally about ethnicity. One is, all these wonderful people were from my same ethnic group, therefore I should be respected for that. That's what you're pointing out is clearly a problem. The other is, all these wonderful people were from my ethnic group, therefore I should try to live up to the standards that. And that, of course, can be very beneficial. Not that I'm going to live up to their standards, but it's a good idea to try, and ethnic pride can help in that direction.
No, that's true.
I'm passing along Peter's observation. I should probably mention one other thing about going back to ancient times, just the fact that there was something called the Holy Roman Empire in the West, long after the Western Roman Empire wasn't there anymore. I think was just basically an attempt to assume that background for themselves.
Yeah, there was that as well. That's right. So, so the attempts of that sort occurred, of course, in relation to Christianity as well, right? And this idea of Europe as Christendom was also an important idea. Now, I agree that there are lots of complex questions arising here. Maybe just responding briefly to your first point. Obviously, the point I'm trying to make is that we should be able to be proud of all of humanity as our ancestors, right? Or to put it symmetrically, all of humanity should be able to be proud of all of humanity. That's what I'm saying we should be aiming for. But I think both of you were pointing out, David and Andreas, you're both pointing out that this is a bit hard. It's somehow easier to group it into, parcel it into portions that where we can pick and choose our identities. Yeah, so that's a definite challenge. But at least I think as a goal, what I formulated is a reasonable thing. And it's possible to educate ourselves in such a way that we can really believe in this.
Okay, I think I will I'm gonna take chair's rights to ask one more question myself before we wrap up, just because I'm intrigued. So you talked a lot, Minhyong, about ancient history, and like at some point, you talk about more modern history in the context of how does modern history understand classic history. And I think there's an interesting overlap, right? Of like lots of mathematicians have a big academic overlap with classicists, but in reality, most of the historians I know are modern historians, And a lot of times when you learn about history of maths, it's very ancient stuff. And you really highlighted the importance of it all. But I'm wondering if you could say anything, I don't know, like why is ancient maths the thing that history of maths seems to probe with so much interest? Why, or maybe it's just that I'm unaware of stuff that's happening. It's very likely, but like, is there interesting things to say about more recent history of mathematics? Like,
yeah, well, that's again, I think, a very complicated question, even to the limited knowledge I have. But part of this, actually, but this is kind of important. There is an important point, to my mind, that's hiding inside this inquiry. So I pointed briefly I referred briefly to this identity politics in the 18th and 19th century, right? So, for example, a lot of Germans and British were very interested in identifying themselves with certain classical traditions, right? So British, for example, wanted to say that they were the inheritors in Egypt of Alexander the Great, things like this, right? Or Greeks wanted to say that they were the first people to true philosophy after the Greeks. So there are various ideas like this. And I think my view is that mathematics played a central role in this creation of traditions, invention of traditions, if you like. Yeah. Because when people spoke, by the way, one thing I want to make clear is that I'm not trying to attack the value of any of these ancient things I'm referring to. I think Euclid is great. What we refer to as Euclid is great. I think Archimedes is great. I also think that what classicists like Homer is great, and the Virgil is great. The Greek tragedies, I love them. So I'm just trying to figure out the nature of the ownership of that tradition by the human race, or all of humanity. But in any case, in formulating the value of this ancient tradition, this idea that Greeks invented mathematics seems to have played a very key role, even among people who didn't know that much about mathematics, especially in the 19th century. And my reasons for saying this is, again, a complex story, so I don't think I really have time to go into it right now. I have to formulate a more careful answer to say this concisely. But the idea is in all kinds of literature that somehow the Greek invented mathematics, and this is what makes them great. Because, so this is my own kind of prejudicial pet theory about it. If you think about inventions in history or inventions in Greek tragedy or something like this, maybe even in the 19th century, people felt like this wasn't quite as substantial as the invention of mathematics. That's a possible perspective that may have informed this particular way of framing things. And so that's my kind of mathematician's prejudice, right? But regardless of that, I think the fact that the invention of mathematics by ancient Greeks played a key role in the conception of the past and our relationships to it does seem to be correct. And this is one of the reasons that as mathematicians, we need to be somewhat interested in it and try to inject some corrective mechanism. Because people, even among the very progressive historians, now people who are changing the classics and so forth, now there isn't that much involvement by mathematicians who, for example, can contribute this perspective, a varying perspective about the view of mathematics that was developed in the 19th century. that's kind of an answer to your question, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. There's lots of interesting stuff to unpick there. Okay.
Yeah. By the way, so maybe I will also add that if you view it from the point of view that I'm advocating, it's very interesting, right? If we talk about it purely in political terms, you may be interested or not, right? But there's a lot of things that are simply academically interesting in trying to figure these things out. What is an accurate picture of the past? That's one thing, right? Now, why did people in the 19th century want to build up this kind of tradition in the fashion that suited them? That's also very interesting to simply investigate.
Yeah, this is very true. Okay. This is a good place to end, I think. So I would like to just thank Minhyong again for such a lovely talk. Thank you very much, Minhyong.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for all your questions.